Well, hello, 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 everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Summer Spotlight. I am your host, Gail Nicholson. I'm so glad to see you back again today. This is wonderful. How are you guys all holding up? If you if it's interesting out there. Here in Arizona, we are on a second lockdown now. So that's interesting after almost a month of not really being reopened and then locked down again. This is going to be interesting to watch. We'll put it that way. Um, I want to thank you and welcome you in. Come on in, have a seat, make yourself a cup of coffee. We're going to have a great little cozy conversation today with an author from New York that I have gotten to know, and our interests are very much aligned in that as a hobby, I love history, American history, going back, prior to the Revolution, and even British history. And this guy has an encyclopedic knowledge of history and geography, and he muddles them all together and he turns them into these amazing stories that I want to talk to you about today. So, let me introduce you to Mr. Nick Rafter, New York native and writer extraordinaire. Also, might sell you a house if he gets a chance. I don't know. Thanks for joining us today, Nick. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you doing, Gail?
I'm doing great. I am doing great. It's really hot here.
Mm.
So I'm very, very grateful to be able to be in air conditioning or by the pool. Those are my two locations these days. I hear it's thundering up there in New York. How are you doing?
Yeah, we're doing great. We're in the middle of our typical humid Caribbean-like summer. We had a couple of really hot days before us and after us, and now we're getting our storms.
Uh huh.
But it's nice to have weather and enjoy it. Yesterday we had a thunderstorm and a rainbow.
Oh,
That
very
I don't know if
nice.
you saw pictures of it on the internet, but it's all over the internet. A beautiful rainbow over the skyline, and
Oh,
cheered a lot of people up and made a lot of people happy. And we need that in New York right now.
right. Well, maybe we can, whether it's true or not, we can always pretend that it's just like before, and God is promising no more plague. So
Yeah, we can hope.
maybe, who knows? So awesome. Um, how's everything else? Let's kind of check in on Corona recovery
Mhm.
in New York, because it was one of the hardest hit areas. What with everybody living literally on top of each other out there, Arizona seemed to escape the first of it. It seemed for so long because we were so sparsely spread communities. Whereas New York City, everything is so tightly compact. I'm sure that things were kind of off the charts for a while. Did you guys ever get to open up at all?
Yeah,
Um,
we're about 50% reopened.
okay.
Um, we opened up general businesses, construction, manufacturing. I went back to work as a real estate agent last week for the first time in person. Actually, was working the entire shutdown remotely.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and offices are allowed to go back at limited capacity, but most have voluntarily decided to keep people working at home. So the subways are busy, the roads are busy. I sat in traffic last week for the first time in 4 months.
Wow.
People are out and about, stores are open, but we haven't opened our indoor dining yet,
Mm-hmm.
and now it looks like we're not going to because of
Okay.
what's going on in other states.
Yeah.
We opened outdoor, and it's actually been a real positive experience. What the city has done, well, first the suburbs and upstate New York has done, and now the city is they've opened up streets for dining. So
Oh.
restaurants have moved their and we have outdoor dining anyway, but
Yeah.
this is another extreme where the streets themselves are being closed and restaurants are being set up in the streets. So it's very like this European piazza situation going on.
Nice.
And in the suburbs, they're using the parking lots, and that's been pretty positive. We've seen a lot of people are enjoying that. It's probably something that I think will stay after this.
Mm-hmm.
The one problem is there has been congregating going on in some of these places.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of bars are doing takeout delivery, so you have people drinking in the streets, like a little bit of a Mardi Gras situation. But we've had that happening now for a few weeks, and we haven't seen any spike in the city.
Good.
The city has been doing really well. We only have a couple hundred cases a day, which seems like a lot, but we were having 9,000 at the peak in the city, and the daily death toll, which was in the 800 range back in April
Okay.
is now down to about single digits, 10, 15 a day, which is, still sad, but
Progress. Yeah.
definitely progress from where we were. We are concerned, though, about what happens with the rest of the states. A lot of people left New York, went to places like Florida and Georgia and Texas, and are now coming back to New York.
Ah,
And
yes.
and there's nothing we can really do about that. We've been forced to quarantine on I think 18 states now, but you really can't enforce it. So we are concerned about people bringing it back to New York. Um, we're hoping that there's some immunity in the people who had it
Mm-hmm.
that will slow transmission rates. There are some neighborhoods I know in the Bronx and Queens where 50% of the population they believe has been hit.
Mm-hmm.
One of every two people. I know entire families that were affected,
Wow.
and there's some hope that at least that will cut transmission a little bit. But we don't know. Nobody really knows,
Right.
and nobody's going to base their assumption on that.
Right.
So
Right.
we're okay. We're hopeful. We're recovering. The city is kind of 50% back to its former self, and it's summer, so it's beautiful to be here. And we're enjoying outside now.
Yeah.
And that's the fun part of it is that we all like being outside, and we're hopeful that low transmission rates mean that we can enjoy that for the next few months.
That'll be wonderful. Could you imagine if, well, in the beginning it was going on during winter time, but could you imagine in the Northeast if this was hitting us in the winter months instead of through the summer months, where we'll all be inside,
Yeah,
breathing the same recycled air constantly and not really having a whole lot of opportunity to get out and exercise out in the sunshine like we
yeah.
get now. How are things different now for you as real estate uh, salesperson? I know that you were working from home remotely. Now you're back in the office. How much of that style of working that you had to assume when you were at home are you going to take into the future with you? Like, hey, this worked. I'm going
Mhm.
to keep this.
Well, I'm lucky in that I have a home office anyway,
Mm-hmm.
so I didn't spend much time in the office to begin with. The By law, real estate brokerages need to have a brick and mortar office space.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have Corcoran, my brokerage, has plenty of them. And I work out of the Williamsburg, Brooklyn office. But there's not enough desk space for everybody. So there's a little bit of a competition to see
Okay.
who gets desk space. We merged, my former brokerage, City Habitats, merged with Corcoran back in January. And as part of the merger, we brought in a lot of Corcoran agents. And I gave up my office desk space for a Corcoran agent to take because I had the ability to work from home. So
Gotcha.
I was already working from home a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Really, the only reason to be in the office is for walking clients who come in, and we don't get much of that in the city. We get
Yeah.
a lot of that in the suburbs and in rural areas. So there really isn't any reason to be in the office except for collaborations and conferences and meetings, and of course, those are on hold indefinitely.
Right. Right.
So we did reopen the office last week. Our office manager is back because she was furloughed, so that was a good reason to open the office.
Mm-hmm.
The way that we've structured it now is that half of the office there are A shifts and B shifts. So if I was to go into the office for any reason, I would only be able to go between 1:30 and 5 Monday to Saturday.
Gotcha.
Previous, I can go anytime I want, middle of the night. At least sometimes go in the middle of the night. And then the A shift from 9 to 12:30 or whatever, and then for the hour lunch period, they clean the office. So that's been a different change. I mean, if I needed a set of keys or I needed paperwork done or I needed to drop off a check, I have a limited time now where I can do it, and I
Mm-hmm.
have to schedule myself around that time. And I also have to make sure I fill out the health assessment and go through that process. The one thing I will say about New York that we're doing good right now is that testing is readily available to anybody who wants to get a test.
Okay.
And so one of the things that I've advised people based on what somebody told me they were doing is if you are planning on going out this week at the 4th of July, because 4th of July is this weekend,
Right.
you are planning on going to the beach or going someplace where you're going to congregate, get yourself a test. You can do that in New York now relatively quickly. And if you know you're negative on Friday, you can feel safe going out Saturday and Sunday. Again, wear a mask and social distance as best you can, but at least you know that you're not carrying the virus out with you.
Yeah.
Um, some states don't have that luxury yet. And, New York is invested in doing that. We're doing 50,000, 60,000 tests a day, which is more than any country is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been extremely helpful. I was saying and I don't. This is not a diss on the rest of the country, but I was saying to somebody that if New York had the ability to shut its borders down,
Mm-hmm.
we would probably eliminate the virus in a few weeks. And
Probably, yeah.
this speaks to the importance of having a national plan on this. Is that when states are doing different things, it's hard for one state to really eliminate it if another state hasn't. And so that's part of the issue that we're having in New York. Part of the concern we're having. We don't like telling people to stay away, but basically we have kind of what Hawaii wants to do, which is stay away until you know you're negative,
Mm-hmm.
and if you know you're negative, then you can
Yeah.
come.
Yeah. That exactly. Um, we have a question here from Marion Simon over in the UK,
Okay.
and she is wondering what thoughts we have if anywhere in the USA. Let me read this more closely here. From the UK, wondering what thoughts has anywhere in the USA put into the strong potential of this virus coming back with a vengeance when the weather cools.
Mm.
Now, neither one of us are any experts on it, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah,
What do you think?
no one's really talking about that, and I'm actually working on a piece right now, expressing my concerns about what happens down the line when it gets too cold to be outside in New York.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then what do you do about dining? What do you do about you know bars? What do you do about gathering? Because right now, I'm gathering with a small unit of my family in my backyard.
Mm-hmm.
I have a pool and everything. What happens? And then of course the holidays. The holidays are a very important time in New York to tourism money for New Yorkers ourselves to go out. I mean,
Yeah.
I walk the city streets during in December all the time, look at Christmas lights and stuff, and it's just wall to wall people.
Right.
And the assumption is it won't be like that, but that's a lot of money and a lot of dangerous activity that's
Mm-hmm.
going to take place in November and December,
Yeah.
just because we can't ban people from having Thanksgiving dinners or Christmas parties. I mean, we could just tell them not to, but we can't, knock down their door and break up a Thanksgiving dinner. So
Exactly.
no one's really been talking about that, and there seems to be this concept of like we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Schools are another concern. A lot of the focus in New York now is to reduce the viral load low enough that we can feel safe opening schools.
Mm-hmm.
We open later than most states. I know most states go back in August. We go back after Labor Day.
Yeah.
So we have more time to work that out. But there's a lot of concern, a lot of we don't know what we're doing. There's at least 5 or 6 different plans on how to go back safely. Whether we go back at all, whether we go back completely, is there going to be block schedules? Is there going to be half remote, half not? Do kindergarten and high school act differently? And
Right.
so, I think a lot of people are just really hoping that some miracle happens,
Yeah.
and kind of less likely that's going to be the case. But there's also a lot of concern over what's temporary and what's going to be a long term. Can we do this for 6 months if there's a vaccine in January, versus what do we have to do for 18 months? And that's a concern in New York.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, and the numbers will lead us basically. I
Yep.
think on that. Um, and hopefully we'll be able to get out there sooner than later because I know
Yeah.
the virus does not do as well when we are in a proper a proper exchange with the universe, so to speak. And what I
Yeah.
mean by that is healthy relationships.
Mhm.
Whether it's picking up the phone and talking to people or whatever, isolation is unhealthy. So
Mhm.
whether Zoom meetings, video calls with people, keeping that, getting out in the sunshine so that your skin's able to process vitamin D and
Right.
fresh air and that kind of thing. So hopefully we'll be able to do something naturally that slows the virus in its tracks.
Mhm.
Because I don't really foresee a whole enough people, honestly, willing to take part in a vaccine or
Yep.
comply with the mandates or the recommendations that we're going to be able to use traditional uh, virology methods
Yeah.
on this. I don't know. Like I said, we're no experts. So let's get back to what you are an expert at, and that is writing and New
Mhm.
York City. And I want to know, how growing up in New York City inspires you, because I grew up in Detroit and New York City inspires me.
Mhm. It's I whenever I talk about New York, I go back to my commute to high school. You know, that's sort of the rudimentary thing that you do as a childhood. You know how you got to high school. You took a bus. Your mother drove you there. We walked maybe. I took city buses to high school, and I had to take two.
Mm-hmm.
And I transferred city buses in a hub in the borough of Queens, where every day I would look to the west to see the Empire State Building. And there were moments when I was in high school where I would stop and I'd say, there are people around the world who spend thousands of dollars to fly to New York just to see that building, and I see it every single day on my way to school. And I remember at one point, a friend of mine and I were going home, and she looked at it and she goes, "Is that the Empire State Building? Wow, I can see the Empire State Building." And for some reason, I remember her excitement about it
Mm-hmm.
in my head is just kind of like the symbol of how lucky you are to grow up in a place where millions of people want to go to
Mm-hmm.
and spend a lot of time and energy going to. And the thing about New York is that New York is a microcosm of the entire country, perhaps the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you would not be surprised to know that there are cowboys in New York, and there are riding rodeos in New York. These things do exist here. They're not common, but they do exist here, and every single culture is here in some way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to feel like you're not you're left out, you can find some place to fit in. I tell people all the time, I grew up in a very tight knit Catholic conservative neighborhood where abortion was bad, and being gay was bad, and all I had to do was hop on the subway
Mm-hmm.
for 40 minutes and I'm in the village in my
Right.
grand's, and it was a completely different world. And it's still like that. I mean, it's less like that now than it used to be, but you know New York has inspired me in a way that I think somebody who traveled the world would be inspired. It's the different cultures basically living under the same roof, same rules, same government, you know, same weather, and how they both interact with each other, but also manage to keep their communities tight. There's a such thing as a tight knit community in New York City. It
Mm-hmm.
exists,
Yeah.
and the coronavirus has really sort of played that up. I mean, you've seen neighborhoods that were incredibly hard hit and neighborhoods that were not hit at all. I mean, there were parts of Manhattan that had a couple dozen cases the entire time.
Interesting.
And there are parts of the Bronx and Queens where, like I said, half the population got it. And you know, people sort of joke about how the virus did not seem to easily go from neighborhood to neighborhood, which seemed odd considering the way New York is.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're in New York, you probably do spend 75% of your time, your free time, just within your neighborhood.
Yeah.
You only leave it to go to work. My father, a good example, works in Manhattan and commutes to Queens every day, and he couldn't be bothered to go to Manhattan any other time other than to go to work.
Mm-hmm.
His idea of leisure is not to go to the city. He works there.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
so that has been part of my inspiration, sort of seeing New York as sort of a miniature globe, and being part of the culture, seeing the culture, experiencing the cultures, and seeing how they interact with each other. And a lot of my writing is that.
Interesting. Now, and you've had forgive me, but you don't seem that much younger than me. That you've probably seen like its changes, its recovery. I mean, obviously you lived through 9/11 there. Possibly even further back.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess what I'm asking with that is, on the continuum of as bad as it's been in New York and as good as it's been in New York, where does right now fall?
Honestly, I'll be very frank, it falls pretty low. This is probably for a lot of people the worst moment in New York City has ever faced because it's just so drawn out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was here for 9/11. I was here for the blackout in
Mm-hmm.
2003. I was here for Hurricane Sandy. And the thing about those, about a month ago, I was driving in New York and I had this thought. And it was when living through those things, they were snapshots in time that they happened. And then we could have got our balance and then came back from them.
Mm-hmm.
And the recovery a lot of times was not great. I mean, 9/11 was a giant hole. Ground Zero was a giant hole for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Sandy, there are houses that only now are being rebuilt from Hurricane Sandy, and that was 8 years ago.
Right.
The crime took decades to bring back down after the crack epidemic and the gang epidemic. you know. But we knew we were recovering, and we saw that progress. And this is hard
Mm-hmm.
because we can't recover until everyone else does. And so, you know, when we see how we recover, it's not a moment where we can say, all right, the virus is over, and now we start to recover it. We don't know when the virus is going to be over.
Right.
And it's frustrating because it's a city that feels like it wants to heal, but it can't.
Yeah.
And it's an incredibly frustrating experience. And I tell people a lot that New York can probably go several months with social distancing and banning mass gatherings, stuff like that. I don't know what happens after a year. I don't know. I mean, the allure of living in New York is a lot of its leisure activities. People move here not because work makes them move here, but also because they want to go to museums, they want to go to Broadway shows, they want to go to concerts, they want to go to the restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't do those things, why live here?
Right.
And a lot of people are facing that reality, which is, I pay a lot. It's expensive to live here, and that's a problem that goes back for a while that we've never really dealt with. A studio apartment in Brooklyn and Manhattan costs $3,000 a month,
That's insane.
and you're talking about a 400, 500 square foot apartment. And as a realtor, I can tell you, we rent those apartments with the idea that you're not going to spend a lot of time here. You're
Mm-hmm.
going to sleep here. You're going to probably eat here once in a while. You're going to be at work. You're going to be out with your friends. You're going to be at restaurants. You're going to be at nightlife and all that other
Right.
stuff. You won't spend a lot of time. And a lot of people just spent the last 3 months in these boxes they
Mm-hmm.
never intended on spending that time. And so
Yeah.
if you tell them, oh, we'll have to do this another year and a half, they're going to look at you and say, I don't have to go to the office. I'm working from home, or I'm unemployed.
Mm-hmm.
Why am I here? You
Yeah.
know, why can't I just go to a cabin upstate or go back to where I live in the Midwest and wait it out and come back when it's over?
Right.
And that's the big concern about New York now is that we didn't have that problem with 9/11. The first thing we did after 9/11 is we went out and ate at restaurants and we were scared to
Supported the
do it.
community.
We
Yeah.
supported the community. We were able to do it. And that's what's hard. That's
Mm-hmm.
what's really hard.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. That fear of the unknown, and
Yeah.
it's different than, yeah, it might be unknown, but we're going to make it known.
Yeah.
To we're at the effect. We're at the effect of something else that's going to make it known, and we still don't have any control over trying to make it known.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very difficult mental space to be in, and to have, gosh, so many people in that city, in that space. That's gotta be a vibe into itself.
Yeah. I mean, I tell people all the time, New York is not built for social distancing.
Right? Right.
It goes against the very nature of what the city is. I mean, you're here because you don't want a social distance. Um, I think that my mother, people have been comparing this last month or two
Mm-hmm.
to the late '60s, especially with the protests that, in New York got violent
Uh-huh.
every once in a while. My mother compares it most to 1977.
Yes.
And I think, and I've taken an interest in that year because my mother was a teenager at the time, and growing up, I grew up around a lot of her music from that era, disco and the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the movies from that era. And the thing about 1977 is, she says that it was the year the city almost completely broke and almost collapsed. A lot of different calamities were happening on top of each other. The
Mm-hmm.
city was bankrupt. We had a blackout. There was a serial killer going around killing people. There were entire neighborhoods in the South Bronx that were being burned for insurance fraud purposes. And there was massive homelessness. There was looting in Brooklyn. And all of this kept happening on top of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it got to the point where a lot of people were like, why do I even live here anymore? And people started leaving. And in fact, the Bee Gees song "Staying Alive" is
Mm-hmm.
about New York in 1977.
No kidding. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and the line that goes "Feel the city breaking, everybody shaking"
Mm-hmm.
is about New York in that year. And New York survived that year. And my mother laughed and she was like, "I just want to let you know, 1978 wasn't that much better." But and there was also the other thing with 1977 is there was an election that year,
Mm-hmm.
and the election really sort of the politics of it played into all the problems. The election was between Ed Koch, who became mayor that year,
Mm-hmm.
and a man named Mario Cuomo, whose last name you might know is
You're right.
his son was the current governor, and the current governor of New York was his father's campaign strategist that year. So a lot of what I think we New York are experiencing in 2020, I think 1977 is a good year to compare it to, and I think the governor even knows that.
Yeah.
Watching him, a lot of his responses to what's going on, a lot of his, you know, assurances to the city and to the state, it seems to come out of a man who remembers that era in New York
So
and
do you
is
think
trying
that
to get through
he's doing a good job of fixing the mistakes that he must have made then
it.
for his candidate not to have won?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, I have some issues with the way that Andrew Cuomo has been as governor,
Hmm.
and also in response to coronavirus. I mean, a lot of our fatalities were in nursing homes, and that was a decision that he made. Now he made it on recommendation of health agencies. And a lot of it was just based on how we didn't know how
Hmm.
many hospitalizations we were going to have, and so we were trying to free up hospital space. But it ended up being a fatal decision for a lot of
Yeah.
nursing homes, and he's been blamed for it, rightly so. And I think that there has to be an accounting for that. But beyond that, I
Hmm.
think he's done a very good job of keeping the state calm. His daily briefings became like things that every New Yorker tuned into, like fireside chats.
Hmm.
He was honest about what was happening. He didn't sugarcoat anything. And he's been kind of like, I mean, I hate to compare him to Daddy, but he's kind of been like this this father figure, this uncle figure for us to look at and be like, how is it going today? And I think that that was helpful. I think that there he almost acted. I think I said to somebody, he almost acted like in a parliamentary system, the opposition leader.
Okay.
Where a lot of people, in absence of national leadership, look to him
Yes.
as sort of a national leader, and I think that that was helpful. But I don't want to give him an AA plus. I think that there's a lot of mistakes that were made. New York probably should have shut down earlier. He dragged his feet on that, and I think that. But generally speaking, I think that he was extremely helpful in us getting through it, and I think he learned from his experience of being in New York in the '70s and '80s,
Hmm.
and knowing how scary it was to be in the city at that time, and how important it was to have somebody to sort of just say, "It'll be all right. These are the problems. We'll face them. Here's how we're going to solve them."
Interesting. Interesting. Um, there's another player as well that seems to be popping up between 1977 and now. Um, Very big name in New York City. Um, is that person going to have a presence in the book that you're writing about all of
Yes.
this? I mean,
Yeah. At first, I didn't know who you were talking about, but yeah, now I understand. Yeah, actually, and I think for those who don't understand, that person is Donald Trump. The Donald Trump came to prominence in 1977 in the late '70s, with his father still running the company at the time. Um, and a lot of Donald Trump's views stem from that era
mm-hmm.
of high crime, of high poverty, of white flight, of intercultural dynamics. I mean, one of the things that I can point into is that there was the Brooklyn neighborhood of Bushwick was badly looted and burned during the blackout in 1977,
Okay.
and it forever changed the dynamic of that neighborhood. And today, Bushwick is actually a gentrified neighborhood. It's sort of what the rest of the country thinks Williamsburg is. It's kind
Mm-hmm.
of hipsterish and you know yuppie-ish.
Okay.
But Bushwick at that time it sits on the Brooklyn Queens border, and the Queens side is called Ridgewood, and the Brooklyn side is called Bushwick, but it's essentially the same neighborhood.
Okay.
And it was German and Italian um, back in the early 20th century, and slowly began to change to a more Hispanic population.
Okay.
And really, once you crossed the border into Queens, it was completely white, German, Italian, but in Brooklyn side, it was mostly Hispanic. When the blackout happened and the looting started in Bushwick, the Queens side of the border very quickly wanted its own zip code. It wanted no part whatsoever to connect to the Brooklyn side.
Okay.
Now, um, just south of Ridgewood is a neighborhood called Woodhaven, which is close to where I live. That is where Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father, grew up. So Donald Trump, the Trumps grew up in that era of Queens politics where the neighborhoods with the minority population were the ones where the crime and the looting were happening.
Mm-hmm.
And in order for you to protect yourself, you had to basically build a proverbial wall around your neighborhood and keep those people out.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, and I was born in 1983, so I was born after that. But this is how we grew up, and where I grew up in Ozone Park, which is only about 2 or 3 miles from Bushwick. It was the center of the mafia, the Italian mafia. It's John Gotti's neighborhood. John Gotti's club was just a few blocks from where I grew up.
Wow.
And uh, the mafia was one of those groups, along with real estate at the time, the Trump organization, that built those proverbial walls and kept the neighborhoods white, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, once John Gotti went to jail, neighborhoods began to change, and a lot of old school, um, ethnically Italian, Irish, Greek, German folks then left the city and went to places like Florida, Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
and other places that Arizona, and remember how mafia, the Trumps, kept their neighborhoods culturally sound until they were no longer in power. And so that was the political ethos that Donald Trump kind of pulled into, not
And
only in New
we
York, but
can
elsewhere.
and we can clearly see the echoes of that when he first took office,
Mm-hmm.
in that he was going to put a wall around America to keep those people
Right.
out, keep our people inside safe. And I'm not trying to judge it one way or the other, but you can always see the echoes of what someone learned when they were younger in how they live
Right.
their life when they're older. I think it says in the Bible, train a child up in the way that they should go, and when they are old they will not depart from it. So we can see that training from Fred Trump playing itself out on a much larger stage now, 30
Yeah.
years later.
There's another year that I think is important in New York City history, and that's 1994.
Uh-huh.
And I'm actually one of the books I want to write about New York is actually titled 1994, because when I was a journalist, when I was a reporter for the Queens Chronicle and the Queens Tribune, I was the only Queens native in the newsroom. So everyone would ask me about what was it like this, like how this news story I'm covering. They reference this time. What happened then? Do you know what happened then? And the year 1994 kept coming up over
Mm-hmm.
and over and over again. And that was the year that Rudy Giuliani took office as mayor. We had a lot of snowstorms that year, which kind of really messed everything up
Mm-hmm.
and were hard to deal with because there were snowstorms, ice storms, and the
Yeah.
weather was a bit of a mess. That was when the crime started dropping precipitously, but it was also when neighborhoods started dramatically changing because of the growing economy. There was the first year out of the early 90s recession. The economy in New York was booming. People were leaving. And that was also the year that, zoning regulations were eased so that luxury skyscrapers started going up. All that stuff happened that year. And that year, locally in my neighborhood, was the year that a man who was the head of the school board, who was extremely socially conservative, ran for the state legislature. And one of his campaign promises, his campaign messages, was that desegregation was bad, and that the school system in New York City was suffering because we had desegregated it, because we had allowed races and cultures to mix.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, he did flat out say black kids were bringing white kids down in terms of their grades by
Yeah.
intermingling them, and that black kids were essentially special ed students who needed their own schools. This was actually an attractive campaign. I went to a private school at the time, and a lot of the parents agreed with this. And my mother at the time was head of the PTA in the school. It was a private school
Mm-hmm.
that actually just closed this year, actually. Um, and we had enrolled the first black kid in my grade, and the parents were up in arms about it. Excuse me. And I remember my mother used to take me to the meetings because I would do homework in the back while the meetings were going on. And I remember a parent standing up and saying, we it's not having anything against black people, but we shouldn't let them in here because they're naturally inclined to rape women, black men, because that's how they procreate in Africa, because it's a large continent, and because it's so large and people don't congregate that often, African men have to rape the first woman they see because that's the only way they can actually
I'm
procreate.
speechless.
My mother was looked at her like, what? And she's like, it's all in National Geographic. Just read it. And I remember sitting there, and for a moment, I was 11. So my first moment, I was like, oh, that sounds plausibly true. I'm thinking Africa's a large continent. It's not really dense. I mean, I didn't know at the time it was densely populated. But I'm like, yeah, you're living in the jungle and you don't really see each other. worms do this, right? I mean, this is what I was thinking.
Wow. And that's how impressionable young children get the wrong
Exactly.
idea.
Obviously, I know that wasn't true. My mother did actually talk to me about that afterwards. My mother grew up in Harlem, so she grew up in a ethnically diverse area.
Hmm.
And they're like, "Don't listen to what that woman said. That's not true." And then obviously, I grew up, but I can totally understand how somebody could have heard that,
Hmm.
connected it to facts. Like my thought was worms, right? Worms are asexual because they don't encounter other worms in the wild that often. And I thought, well, maybe if there's a human being who doesn't encounter another human being, the only way they can scientifically survive is by forcing procreation. These are the things that were popping in my mind.
Right, right.
So I write that I have that story as part of an example of how if you don't teach people the right things, impression ability can happen because it is connected to people sort of trying to make a logical argument in their minds to what they heard.
Hmm.
And by the way, that woman is still alive, and she lives in the same complex in Florida that Trayvon Martin was killed.
Oh my.
So I wanted
Yeah.
to put that out. Um,
Interesting.
but this was in 1994, so this
Hmm.
is only 25, 26 years ago. So part of my writing about New York City is exploring that, and exploring how it's ironic that I think that New York has exported the virus to the rest of the country because New York has exported Trumpism to the rest of the country as well.
Hmm.
People blame the South, they blame the history of racism in the South and all that stuff, and that definitely is something they tied into. But Trump is an entirely New York phenomenon.
Yeah.
There's nothing about him that isn't New York, that
Yeah.
isn't his era in New York and where he came from. And I think it's important
Really
people
good
know
point.
that.
Yeah.
That really is how we work.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a sobering thought.
We've changed. I mean, New
Yeah.
York is a very different place than it was 25 years ago. And a lot of my writing I'm trying to explore that as well, how New York changed.
Well,
And it especially happened in the last 10 years.
I think a lot of places have actually finally started to shift in the last 10 years. Um, and I think there are a lot of contributing factors to that. One of which, the most major one, I think, being social media.
Yeah. True.
Because right, wrong, or otherwise, we have this plexiglass in front of us, if you will, that is the phone screen, that
Mhm.
we tend to or seem to not have any problem with setting a woman like that one straight
Right.
about our opinion of what it should be, right? Now, where right, wrong, or otherwise, we are being exposed to other perspectives, and hopefully, some of the more community minded perspectives are, reteaching some of the old isolationist
Mhm.
perspectives. And we're raising our kids with a lot more of a community mindset as well. I think having grown up in Detroit, I've always looked at New York like a melting pot, like a meshing of cultures. In Detroit, there is, forgive me for going off on this tangent, but there's the the inner city
Right.
below 8 Mile,
Right.
which are neighborhoods that white flight took all the money out of them. There's no jobs, there's no recovery. There's in some places you have people that are paying people to sleep on their property so that other people don't vandalize it because there's no business going on there,
Yeah.
right? That type of thing. Um, and then just above 8 Mile, Oakland County was the most affluent county outside of the state of California for much of the 90s,
Hmm.
right? So you've got this new money white people, and you've got this horribly run down and destroyed city that no one's investing in. And then
Hmm.
there's the downtown core that had all the theater district and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So there is a distinct racism in people from Michigan, but I think that it's a slightly different flavor than you find in other areas of the country.
Yeah. New York is not that that perfectly aligned. We do have neighborhoods like that, or
Mm-hmm.
we did have neighborhoods like that, but I actually think the subway and public transit prevented us from becoming like that. And I think the reason is to get from one white affluent neighborhood to the other, you have to go through a poor neighborhood. I went to a very wealthy private school in Queens,
Mm-hmm.
where everyone who went there was pretty affluent. I mean, and it was diverse. I mean, because there are affluent black neighborhoods in the city. I mean, Queens for a while, I don't know if it's still the case, but was the only county in the country where the average income for blacks was higher than whites, because there
Interesting.
are several neighborhoods in Southeast Queens, St. Albans, Rosedale, Laurelton, that are fairly wealthy black neighborhoods. Jazz artists live there. Jackie Robinson lived there. There's a lot of mansions there. They're beautiful neighborhoods, and there are a lot of poorer white areas like the Rockaways,
Mm-hmm.
or it used to be Astoria, but now Astoria is fairly wealthy. Um, and so I went to a diverse school, but to go home, I had to take the bus through Corona, Queens, which is a fairly poor area.
Mm-hmm.
So I was exposed to that.
Right.
It wasn't on the other side of the railroad tracks, so to speak. I had to go through it. And because of that, I had the experience of, or go through Jamaica, Queens, another example. I had the experience of having to switch buses in Jamaica, Queens, and meet people who live there and deal with people who live there. And I also had the experience of getting mugged in a rich neighborhood, which completely, like
That'll mess with
your
your head.
whole, yeah, your whole concept of what poverty is.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I mean, but New York has its community minded racism, and some of my writing just sort of deal with that,
Mm-hmm.
in that era, and also how, going back to that woman that spoke in my mother's PTA meeting. I've asked her several times why no one challenged her, and she said, "Well, why would we do that? Why would we start a fight?"
Yeah.
And it was interesting to me that she said that, because the social pressure of not challenging those viewpoints is extremely powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And that is only something I'm starting to learn now as an adult,
Yeah.
of how much of this was, especially now that we're able to speak out against this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing a lot of the adults of that era who never spoke out or just casually agreed, speaking out now and saying, I wish I was able to be so openly, challenging to this in 1994. I
Right.
wish I was able to tell this woman to, take a hike,
Right.
but I was
Do you
worried about social pressure.
have you ever seen the movie The Help?
Yeah.
There's a great couple of really great scenes in there, where first the young mother gets socially pressured
Mhm.
into letting go of her maid, right? And
Yeah.
you're kind of led to go, oh, she's young, she'll get it sooner or later, she'll be able to stand up for herself. And then later on in the movie, you see an older mother
Yeah. Well,
that is put in the same position and also caves. And
right.
I think that's one thing that 20 somethings right now, and definitely teenagers coming up, don't have any concept of, is that people in our generation and above, you didn't talk back.
Yeah.
You did not contradict someone in a social situation like that. Who's that? That SNL, I want to say Buck Henry, I think. There's no reason to be impolite at a cocktail party, right?
Yeah.
It was that kind of an era. You might mumble under your breath and walk away, but you walked away and they didn't hear what you had to say back
Yeah.
then.
And there's also not even wanting to be polite. There was a fear of repercussion. I mean, in
Yeah,
New York, you had the scenario where that you didn't know that woman knew somebody in the mob who was going
yeah.
to come and slash your tires, or screw up your business or something. And some of my first novel that I wrote that's still unpublished,
Mm-hmm.
called Lower Than the Angels, deals with this in terms of inside the community of the Catholic Church in Southern Queens in
Right.
that era. And we know there's a lot of church abuse that went on among the priests then, that everyone knew about, but no one said anything.
Yeah.
And a lot of it wasn't about, oh, we shouldn't talk about these things. It was general fear of what would happen if that delicate detente collapsed.
Yeah.
What would happen if the church was no longer the dominant force in this neighborhood?
Mm-hmm.
Who would come here? Who would move here? How would we survive? How would this community live? And a lot of that was that. It was the fear of, if we spoke up, it would destroy everything.
Yeah.
And since then, my neighborhood has dramatically changed. In fact, just this last week, there was a primary in which our longtime incumbent assemblyman was ousted in the primary by a young woman of Indian descent. and it was dramatic. I mean, she defeated him by a large margin, and a lot of people are talking about this as like the ultimate sign the neighborhood has changed
Mm-hmm.
because the neighborhood now is mostly Indo-Caribbean, it's South Asian, there's a large Sikh population, there's a large Bangladeshi population on the Brooklyn border. Um, and everyone sit there and said, well, this is because you all spoke out against the mafia. This is because you put John Gotti in jail. This is because you weakened the church. All of these are all the reasons why our neighborhood changed.
Gotcha.
And the blame goes on people like in my generation for speaking out.
Mm-hmm.
We weakened those bonds.
Yeah.
And I mean, I come to the conclusion that those bonds needed to be weakened, and my writing comes to that conclusion as well because they were untenable and they were damaging people. But that is part of the social structure. And again, going back to Donald Trump, he plays into that.
Yeah.
He played into that idea, which was that was the whole idea of making America great again, making Ozone Park great again. Back when it was when you just shut up and you went to serve mass and the priest cut you, you were quiet about it,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And there are still people who want to go back to that, and it's important, I think, now for us to sort of remind them that's not happening.
Right.
We're not going back to that. It's over. It's in the past. And I think the pandemic plays in that as well, because we talk about a new normal. You know, there's a new normal not only post-pandemic in terms of our health and how we interact. There's a new normal in our social structure
Mm-hmm.
as well that I think we have to sort of get used to. You know, I
Yeah,
don't know how
you
that
know,
plays
I've,
out.
I've noticed that actually in that the first few weeks of being in the quarantine, you get used to being alone on your own, right? And for me, now this is just my experience, I noticed that when I would go out for a walk after not having gone out for a walk in a while, and I would see people on the street, like just neighbor in front of his house on his own sidewalk on the other side of the street, I felt like I wasn't allowed to talk to them,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And I mean, it's very subtle, but that is a reconditioning of,
mm,
that goes along with the whole picture of quarantining, isolating. You're on a
yeah,
timeout. You go to your room. Um, there's this background feeling that we are being punished for something,
yeah,
right?
yeah. And I get that too. I mean, I get that a lot too. And that's one of the interesting things about the protests is, you know, my concern about when the protests started here in New York was that it would completely break down social distancing because we were on that verge of it breaking already. Because, like I said, New York is not built for social distancing,
Mm-mm.
and people wanted that interaction. They felt like, you know, we're 8 9 weeks into this now. The cases were declining. You know, if any of us had it, we don't have it anymore. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there was this attitude of, well, how long are you gonna make us do this? When are
Right,
you gonna get your act together and figure out a way that we can live normally with this?
right.
You know, we're not sitting around waiting for you to do this. And then as soon as the protest happened, it was, you know what? If they can protest, I can go to a birthday party.
Yeah.
If they can protest, I can open up my business. And that attitude began to, and I kind of warned people about this, that there might be a moral reason why the protests are okay and going to a bar is not.
Mm-hmm.
But having that argument is going to be very difficult to convince people about it.
Yeah.
You know, people want to have that social interaction. And also, I had friends who went to the protests and they did believe in the cause of the protests, but literally said, "Oh, I just wanted to get out of the house." Which fair. I mean, I thought about it too, and I didn't ultimately go because I said, you know what? Would I go if it was normal times? Probably not. So it's not really right for me to go now because I want to have social interaction with people behind a mask.
Right.
You know, but people did that, and I think that is the concern about like where we go from here with this virus is that I don't feel that human beings are necessarily made to be in social isolation for that length of time. It's one of the reasons why I thoroughly oppose the idea of solitary confinement in jails. I think it's
Exactly.
just mentally damaging.
It is.
And yes,
Agree.
you know, we have to do it for a time to get cases down to normal level. But there are people who are like, no, we should all be on lockdown until a vaccine comes out. And I'm just like, even the experts think that's a bad idea. You know, like for social reasons. And I think that for introverts, it's okay, but even people like I don't want I hate to bring him up because he gets mad at me when I do. My partner is kind of an introvert and likes being on his own. And even he gets to the point where he's like, I don't think I can do this anymore. You know, like I miss
Yeah.
going to see my coworkers and I miss going to the bar with Ken or I miss going to see our friends, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that we have to learn how to do this safely. You know, masks are an important thing. I'm glad that in New York at least masks are becoming kind of a status symbol, where it's like, what kind of mask did you buy? What kind
Right.
of mask? I got a fancy kind of mask. I got one with a New York City flag on it. I got a Mets mask. I got a Yankees mask. And even in Staten Island, which is a very conservative area, there was a video of a woman getting forced kicked out of a supermarket by other shoppers because she wouldn't put on a mask.
Hmm.
And I think that kind of social pressure needs to happen nationally. And I'm glad to see it happening in New York at least, because I think that will help us get back that social desire that we need, at least until we can figure out how to treat this and cure it. Um, even going to do work the other day, I was glad to see my clients. We all wore a mask and we were a few feet apart from each other, and we had a long, nice conversation.
Hmm.
And it felt good to have that.
Yeah. It we I don't think that we as human beings developing, right? That science has really gotten to the point where it really understands the energetic exchange between beings in relation, in community, in conversation, in social structuring. I think they've got an inkling, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think that they really get how the interchange between human beings fuels the health of each human being. I mean, you've had conversations with people where you walk away and go, "Oh my God, I just need a nap or a drink, one or the other, because they just sucked it right out of me."
Yeah.
Right? And then there's obviously other people too that you have a conversation with them and you just bounce away,
Yeah.
right? And lots of times those people are so charismatic they become rock stars, so to speak, because everybody feels so good when they're around, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I just don't think that even in the social sciences that we get the value of that. Or
Yeah.
maybe I'm completely wrong and people do get the value of that, and that's exactly why it's being taken away from us.
I think physical presence is also important, and maybe I'm speaking from my own experiences. I have an article that I'm posting on my blog tomorrow about how quarantine was absolutely my worst nightmare. I've always had a crippling fear of loneliness, and I've
Mm.
had nightmares. Like in college, I ran the radio station in my college, Hofstra University on Long Island. I want to plug it because I love my college so much. Um, where I was locked in the radio station at night and had to run the place by myself, and it was like a paralyzing nightmare,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so when this started, I was home with my parents, my family, so I had people present with me. But I talked about how this was my worst nightmare. I mean, being socially isolated.
Mm-hmm.
Marilyn Monroe had a quote, and Marilyn Monroe is one of my idols, one of my like go-to people, because she dealt with serious cases of mental illness and that kind of stuff. And so have I. So
Mm-hmm.
I look at her as kind of like a little bit of an icon,
Uh-huh.
um, angel, so to speak. She had a quote where she said, it's often enough just to be with somebody. You don't have to say. I'm paraphrasing, but you can look it up later. Those of you who are looking, it's often not enough just to be with somebody. You don't have to say anything. A feeling passes between you. You're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
And she was talking about it. And I believe this is the story that she was talking about it concerning Montgomery Clift while filming a movie.
Okay.
I think it was Montgomery Clift, where, you know, he
Place in the
thought,
sun, I think.
yeah, yeah, he she wanted to let him know that she just wanted him there,
Mm-hmm.
because he was kind of I don't say prude, but he was like, I'm not looking to sleep with you, and she kind of got offended by that, and she's like, I just want a physical presence with me. I'm so lonely all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and so that quote came from that. And I feel that same way, that growing up, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, I had trouble sleeping by myself. I made my mother stay with me until I fell asleep. I needed to have the physical presence with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so social isolation is extremely damaging to my mental health. I can't be the only one,
Right. Right.
and so that need to be present with somebody else, it really is kind of scary to think that we cannot have that for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And finding a way to get that back while we battle this virus, I think, is important. And we can't just dismiss it as just people being selfish.
Yeah.
I mean, there is selfishness to this. I mean, people going to, a pool party in the middle of, might be a little bit selfish, but people really struggling. I mean, suicide rates in Queens skyrocketed
Yeah.
during the lockdown. I
Well,
help out with a local suicide hotline. They were getting calls off the hook. I had a friend of mine who threatened to kill herself, and I had to talk her down from that on like day 4 of the lockdown. It's real. It's a
wow.
real
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
And people come to New York to escape that. They come to New York to not have to experience that. And so it's hard that we weren't able to have that for so long. And the hope is that we will be able to have it, going forward in a safer way.
Yeah, absolutely. And along those lines, Zoom meetings, seeing people's faces that you don't often get to see, chatting with people that you don't, new experiences, those are good resolutions, but the power of human touch
Yeah.
is untouchable when it comes to the mental health of a person.
Yeah.
I came up for a while through 12-step meetings. And in the little town that I was in at the time, there were a couple of people that would show up, obviously homeless, just stunk to high heaven. The same clothes that they wore 2 months ago, probably have not taken them off since, kind of thing. I mean, just people who literally live on the street. And really, this one guy that I'm calling to mind really didn't have any intention of quitting drugs. But he showed up to those meetings every night for a hot cup of coffee and a hug from anybody who would be willing to hug him.
Yeah.
And I've never forgotten that because, he chose his life on the streets, but the only thing that he could not get away from is the need to be touched.
Yeah, I feel that.
Right?
I do. Hugs
Yeah.
are so important to me.
Yeah.
And, I can still get them from obviously my loved ones, but the idea of not being able to touch anybody who, obviously wants to be touched,
Yeah.
scary. It's a scary experience. And, it's about reclaiming that back now in a safe environment. And also just we talk about the economic problem of this, which is like, oh, you want to send everyone back to work to help the economy. Oh, you want to, kill grandma for the Dow and all this stuff that people are saying. We're not talking about the social aspect of it. And I think we need to.
Yeah.
We really need to. And I think we really need to focus on how it damages us emotionally and mentally to not have concerts and bars and all this other stuff. Because that is a major source of joy
Yes.
for so many people.
Yeah.
And it's understandable we can't have it, but we need to talk about the effects of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and our connection today, and we have gone extremely long by our regular format. So thank you so much for an engaging and interesting conversation together today. Do you have any final thoughts for our audience?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I will want to say is that when the virus passes, please come to New York.
Yes.
I will show you around. If you want to
Excellent.
live in New York, I can help you do that too.
Awesome.
And yeah, and stay safe. Wear a mask. There's nothing wrong with wearing a mask. It's cowboys do it. Just wear a mask, be safe, and don't do anything dumb and stupid, and we'll get through this.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being with me today. I appreciate you. You take
Thanks,
care.
Gail.
All
You
right.
too.
Bye.
Bye.
When you open your energy, recovery progresses so much faster. That recovery is possible. You do not have to live as a victim until your last days. You have unbelievable strength, and I know that because you're still here. Do you want to create something completely unrecognizable with your life? I can show you how.